In this episode, Priyamvada Ramkumar talks about her literary journey, translating Tamil writer Sri.Jeyamohan's Aram short stories into English, and about her future projects. Her translation of Stories of the True was selected under the South Asia Speaks Mentorship Program for 2021, where Arunava Sinha mentored her. Juggernaut Books published the book in 2022. The same year, she was selected into the American Literary Translation Association Mentorship Program, where she worked with award-winning translator Kareem James Abu-Zeid. She was awarded the Heim Translation Fund Grant in the year 2023 for her work-in-progress translation of White Elephant, again a novel by Jeymohan, Vellai Yaanai. Earlier this year, she won the A Muttulingam Translation Award for Stories of the True, instituted by Vijaya Vasagar Vattam. The award recognizes translations from Tamil to English. Priyamvada, welcome to our podcast, Arshini.
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's a great show you have on here, and I'm very happy to be on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Your medium of instruction during school was English. How did you start reading Tamil literature?
So I did go to an English medium school. This was under the CBSE system, but I learned Tamil formally in school. It was my second language, as we call it. Having said that, I must admit that I came to Tamil literature much later. I think all my reading while I was in school was, I would say, almost exclusively in English. But I started reading fairly early. I remember there are 2 or 3 memories I have from childhood. One is, of sitting in my grandfather's room. My grandfather was a journalist back in the day. He retired as assistant editor of Indian Express. And he was a voracious reader. At last count, he's no more now, but at last count, his library contained like 3,000 books. So I would, he had this room where there was this single cot surrounded by books on 3 sides. And I always found it fascinating to sit in his room and just, look at those books. He was, of course, a history buff. So his room was filled with, I think, history and heritage were his 2 big interests, not fiction. But somehow I think the bug transferred itself from him to me. The other person that I think influenced me a lot was, of course, my father. He also read widely, but exclusively in English. But thanks to him, in middle school, I was I think as early as 6th or 7th grade, I was reading Woodhouse. But a lot of my reading in school was, I just read widely and indiscriminately. I think I wouldn't say this was always serious literature, right? Like I'd read the likes of Jules Verne and Jane Austen on one side, and then there was on the other. I read Alistair MacLean and Daphne du Maurier, and I came to serious literature much later. I think in my mid-20s. That's when I read some of the European masters. Tolstoy and Camus and Hermann Hesse and so on. And in parallel to all this was what was happening in Tamil. And in school, I must say that I had some really wonderful teachers, right? And who instilled a love for the language in me. In fact, when my sister and my cousins they shifted to Sanskrit when they had the option in grade 6. I kind of refused to do that because I was very keen on continuing with Tamil. And but the sad part is, they did not expose me to modern Tamil literature. The exposure we had was largely classical Tamil literature and Tamil grammar, which again was a very fascinating subject for me. But neither at home nor in school, was I exposed to modern Tamil literature, and I wish it was different today. So I finally came to it through Aram, which is the book I ended up translating as late as I think 2012, when my now husband kind of gave me the book and said, "You must read this." And that was really the first I mean, I had read a little bit of like Vasanti and Shivashankari kind of writers earlier, but this was the book that really got me hooked to the fiction, so to say, in Tamil.
On our podcast, you are the third Tamil to English translator that we are talking to. We spoke to Suchitra Ramchandran, of course. She translated beautifully Yela Mulgamdi into Abyss. And then we spoke to Aniruddhan Vasudevan. It's very interesting that all three of you started with English, almost in the same age group. And you came back to Tamil. You not stopped it reading, right? You started translating it. I believe it's very vibrant, the Tamil to English translation. It's a very good trend.
Yeah, I think translations from Tamil to English, of course, goes back a long way. It's not in it's one of the languages, maybe after Bengali and Malayalam, which has been translated the most. So there's certainly a lot of history to look back on and take inspiration from. They're very senior translators like Mr. Kalyan Raman, Padma Narayan, and so on, who have really shown us the way, to this world. Having said that, I think, as is the case, I think across the country, this really happens from a place of passion, because today I don't think there are any formal courses that one can go to learn translation. Maybe now there's one that's conducted by the Ahmedabad University. But it's lacking this formal education in that sense for someone who's inclined to this craft is that lacking. So you really take to it out of passion. And normally, I think maybe as was the case, I was listening to your podcast with Anirudhan, and I think he said he was really taken by the book and wanted to translate it. Right, so it's that's probably a commonality again in all of our journeys. It's some particular text that has inspired us to start this journey, and it's really from a place of sharing more than anything else that this journey begins, I think.
No, as we read more and more of translations, one thing that I realized is that a good translator, with a lot of passion and understanding of the language, he can be a great curator.
No, absolutely. I think that's very true. And, I often think about, now that I have translated one book and I'm working on my second, I often think about what does this really mean to me? And, do I want to become a professional translator? And the answer that I keep coming back to is I'm doing this purely, for the love of sharing the works that have moved me with a broader audience. And in that sense, I don't think I would ever want to be a professional translator, right? And I don't want to be translating something that is handed to me and I'm commissioned for, and I don't necessarily have my own sort of passionate reading of the text. So I can't imagine myself doing that. And I think that's probably the case with a lot of other people in the translation world. So what we are eventually, when we look back, I mean, it's too early for me to say big words like body of work and all of that. But even if I do, let's say 5, 6 books, when I look back, I would want to say that these are books that I really believed in, and they moved me, and they taught me something about life. And these are great stories that I want to share with the world. So I think what you're saying about translators acting as curators is definitely true in my case. And as I see the body of works of some of the senior translators, I would say that it's definitely true of the community itself.
I think writer Jeyamohan has been writing for the last 3.5 decades or more, I think, 88 or 87. Now, surprised to learn that Stories of the True is his first English
Yeah.
translation.
So, I mean, it honestly it baffled me, right? Which was one of the reasons I decided to translate this book. Technically, though, it's not. I wouldn't say it's his first to appear in English. There were, I think, there's this novel Card which was translated into English before Stories of the True, but it was published by a Tamil language publishing house. This is the first time something is coming out in a national press. So when I look back at it, I didn't really understand the why when I started doing this. It was just I started translating this book almost in protest, like, how could he not be in English? But when I look back now, I think there are three ways in which a book can travel from a non-English Indian language to the Anglophone sphere. One is through a publisher. A publisher sort of identifying an important writer in let's say Tamil, and commissioning a translator to bring it into English. And that now, to me, it's clear why that never happened with Jemon, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about him as a person. In the process of pitching this book to various publishers, that became quite clear. And it was also something that Suchitra faced. So we had to dispel a lot of myths along the way to actually get him into English. The second way in which an author can travel is if the author himself or herself takes the initiative. And with Jemon, that was never going to happen, because I don't think this was really, even today, I don't think this is his priority, right? Whatever is happening is because of the interest that others have shown in his writing. So it really fell on, the third way in which a book can travel is, as you said, through the two translators who act as curators. And that is essentially what has happened here. So to me, the surprising part is why hadn't any other translator picked up his work before Stories of the True came out. And I don't think I have a definitive answer to that, except to say that I guess for every writer there is also a generation of translators who have to emerge to take them into another language, as was the case with Tolstoy, right? It happened after many, many years. Constance Gardner took his work into English. And in Tamil, I would also argue that um, as a writer, I think Jaimon has probably influenced people of my generation in the like 30s and 40s more than probably those in their 60s or 70s. And maybe we just needed a new crop of readers who I really identified with his work to take this to take this across linguistic boundaries.
Please tell us about the process of translation of this book. Mm, how did you start, and how did you approach Sri Jeyamohan? And
Um, So I think, as I mentioned, 2012 is when I read the book first, and then it really moved me. I many of the stories that I read in the collection moved me to tears. I remember reading especially Penance of the Goddess, which is Tayar Padam in Tamil, and I was literally crying, and it reminded me so much of my own grandparents' relationship. So there was a deep personal impression that the book left on me. And so even though after that I started reading more widely in Tamil, this was a book that I cherished. So in 2017, I think I read Gachar Gochar, which is the Kannada writer Vivek Shanbag's beautiful novella, and translated brilliantly by Srinath Perur. And I read that actually two times back to back, and some it sparked something in me. There was this question that arose as to why should I, if Aram hasn't been translated before, why not try my hand at it? But I did not really have any grand plans at that time, except to it was just some creative urge that I wanted to give space to. And so I translated the first story, Aram, which is the Song of Righteousness in English. And I started sharing it with a few friends I mean, some of them had read the original as well, some of them who only read in English. and the feedback was encouraging. And curiously, so I used to translate in snatches of time because I hold a fairly intensive job in the investing world, and I didn't really have I didn't create the time to do this in a disciplined way, I would say. So basically translate in these snatches of time that I got, like on flights from Chennai to Delhi and so on. On one such flight, I was translating, and this lady next to me, she asked me if I was a writer. And I said, no, that's how I answered it back then. Today, I would probably say translators are also writers, but I clarified that I was just translating this collection of stories. And this turned out to be Prabhashri Devan, who is also a translator from Tamil to English. She's translated Chudamani and I think more recently Uvesa's essays and so on. So this was a very serendipitous meeting, and I took up her offer to read and give me feedback. So I sent her the stories, and she was also quite encouraging, and I got some good feedback from her. So all of this gave me the confidence to then approach Jemon. So after I had done like 3 or 4 stories, I sent it along to him and I asked him for permission to translate the entire collection, and he almost immediately said yes. Until today, I wonder where he got the confidence from, but yeah, I'm glad he took that leap of faith.
Was it subjected to any editing or any?
Yeah, so it was a long journey from there, a long and winding road, I would say, before I got it to publication in 2022. Because, as I said, I wasn't doing it in a very disciplined way to begin with. I think really between 2017 and 2020, I would do one story here, one story there, and there'd be a long hiatus in between, because largely because of the nature of my work. So I started spending time in a concerted way on the collection only in 2020, I think, when the pandemic happened. So the entire sort of work from home framework gave me the ability to spend at least a couple of hours on this endeavor daily. And and then I started sharing this with writers as well. Like for instance, Mr. P. A. Krishnan, who's a bilingual writer in Tamil and English. So I found people to share this with and get more and more feedback, because I thought that was important, to make sure that I'm headed in the right direction. Um, then once I had like 8 10 stories, the question of what I'm going to do with this now came up, and I spoke with Mr. Kalyan Raman and with Srinath Perura. I think I mailed him perhaps, and both of them enlightened me to this community of people called literary agents, who I had no idea of at that point. And both of them mentioned Kanishka Gupta's name. He runs the writer's site, which is, I think, the leading literary agency in India. So I spoke to him. He asked me to send along the stories, and it was sort of a mini pitch, I would say, because I had to convince him first. But luckily for me, he absolutely loved the stories. And within a couple of days, he had read them, and he told me that he's very excited to take this to publishers. While this was happening, I think I was also I'm someone who likes a structured learning process. So I was on the once I knew that I wanted to pursue this seriously, I started looking out for avenues where I could hone my craft. So I attended a couple of translation workshops. One run by Daniel Hahn, who's a award-winning translator from, I think, Spanish and Portuguese into English, and also Deborah Smith, who won the Booker International for the vegetarian Korean novel. So I put myself through some of these workshops, and soon after that, this program called South Asia Speaks was launched in 2021 by Sonia Fellerio, who's a writer. Um, so I applied to that and I was selected into the cohort. I got the opportunity to work with Arunava Sinha on this particular book, right? So we used to have these short 20, 25-minute sessions where He'd give me very, very insightful feedback on my translations, and that helped me improve the stories to a great extent. And so that's how things happened. And of course, I must also thank Suchitra, who read the entire manuscript when it was done, and helped me improve it even further. And of course, there was an editing process at Juggernaut's end. There was a copy editor who they'd engaged to look over the text, and that was also a fairly intensive exercise, given that it was my first such experience. And finally, I think the book came out in August 2022.
So, what is the major learning for you? Interactions with various people, copy editors, other fellow translators, as far as the translation goes, where you started and where the book ended up.
The biggest learning for me is probably encapsulated in what Arunava told me in one of our discussions, and it really stayed with me, which is going from translating content to translating intent. Um, and when I started off, obviously there was a great fidelity to the text, and I was very conscious of the fact that I should not add or subtract to what has been written by Jemon. But there are, while that is important, it is equally important to make sure that ultimately what you're writing in English renders the same impression on the reader that they as they would have if they read the as they would have had if they had read the original text in Tamil. And for that, you do need to take certain creative liberties. And this is what makes translation an interesting exercise as well, right? So constantly you're in this sort of tension between fidelity and creativity, and so you have to make a lot of choices in the process. So I think I got better at making those choices by putting myself through some of these workshops and mentorship programs.
Wonderful. Now, the place where writer Jeyamohan hails from, it's Nagarkoil. And all these stories, I think they are based on real persons only. In fact, at the end of the book, there are details. And one interesting thing about these stories, majority of the stories, if you take Piruvali or Cherninkad or Meal Tally, you can see there is lot of peaceful coexistence and positive influence of one religion over the other.
It is certainly a reflection of what we are as a state. There is a lot of plurality in this region in terms of both, I would say, language and religion. Especially Kanyakumari, I think, given that it's been a melting pot of both Tamil and Malayalam in some way. So it's both linguistic and religious diversity is definitely there, and that reflects itself, finds its way into the stories as well. Having said that, I think I would also mention that the fact that we are noticing it is probably a reflection of our times, because this shouldn't really raise an eyebrow. But the fact that we are noticing it, I think, tells me more than what's in the text. Um, but I also wonder, when you say that, I also wonder whether this was always the case, right? I don't know if there was always a peaceful coexistence. I remember in this scroll interview that Suchitra and I did with Jayamohan, he speaks about his early years in this region, and he talks about how there was a Christian hegemony at that point of time, and to the point that temples were not allowed to ring the bells, and they had those clappers had to be covered with cloth so that the noise wouldn't emerge. So so I think it's also something that they have worked hard at. I don't think it has been so automatic. He talks about how later on there were leaders also within the Christian community who spoke for a peaceful coexistence, who spoke for living harmoniously between the various communities. So I think it's something that they have worked hard at. Is the sense that I get. But beyond all that, I feel as far as literature goes, what is important is not the representation itself. What is important is how honest you are about the world that you're depicting and how authentically you're depicting it, right? So for instance, one could write about disharmony in a just because you want to paint a picture of political activism and so on. So the question is really for me how authentically and honestly you're writing about. So there shouldn't be a perverse interest to talk up harmony or disharmony. It should really reflect the world that you are putting on paper. So that for me is important. Like for instance, I was recently reading this novel Naivedyam, which is written by Pumani. He's another great contemporary Tamil writer, and he writes about this village that is going through an agrarian crisis, and obviously there are there are Brahmin communities who are more well off and they are landed, and there are other castes. There are Dalits who are more laborers, but it's written in a way that is not. It's so. I mean, caste works in insidious ways. It doesn't work in a very obvious way in real life in many of these places. And I found that he rendered that very beautifully, right? So there were no acerbic voices rising in favor of the laborers, or it was a very balanced and very real world that he was presenting, and I feel that that is what makes us relate to these books even more.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, one more interesting thing about the way writer Jayamohan depicts the environment there. Normally, when you read any regional language writing, I would say Indian writing, you see there will be a lot of references to the, let us say, the culture, the food, and all that, and the terrain, of course. If there is any specific characteristic of the terrain, they talk about the terrain too. Now, instead of that, there are a lot of references to literary giants and writers, and he talks about he mentions about Sundar
Mm.
Ramaswamy, Mauni, and some magazines, Manikodi, Kumudam, Subhamangala. There are many, many references. In that case, he talks about freedom fighters and all. I find that very interesting and very elucidating too. Like, you get to know the culture through the people, great people who lived. I really liked it, that part.
I think there's probably both. There are stories which, so there are two kinds of stories in this collection, right? One is in Tamil, we call it Agam and Puram, the interior world and the exterior world, so to say. So you have a set of stories like the Penance of the Goddess, Song of Righteousness, even Peacock Blue, and so on, which are, I would say, are stories which focus on the interior world, and you would probably find more references to culture in those. And then there are stories which deal with the exterior world, like some of the ones that you mentioned, and that's where I think we find references to other personalities, and so on. So it's also interesting that Jayamohan, when he talks about Aram, he says, or in general his writing, he says that he thinks of himself as a bard or a Pauranika. Um, so there is a great tradition in Tamil. If you go back to Sangam literature, for example, where poets sang of others. So there's a hat tip to that in Elephant Doctor as well, where Dr. V. Krishnamurti talks of this poet Kabilar, Kabilar, of course, famously sang of many kings, including Pari. And Jaimon often invokes that example to illustrate his point on why he thinks of himself as a bard. And I think that's what's happened with Stories of the True. So in a way he is singing praises of many of these great souls who lived, and showed us how to live. And in that process, obviously, if you're talking about the world of a writer, whether it's an Aram or Peacock Blue, then you are going to pepper it with the names of other writers that they interacted with, and that's what's really happening for me. As a reader, when I came to this book for the first time, it almost served as a quick primer on Tamil literature itself, because it was introducing me to many names that I had never heard of before. But at the same time, as a translator, this was a bit of a challenge because there are many arcane references, and I wondered if somebody reading it in English who's not familiar with this milieu would really get it. But I drew confidence from two things. One is that when I read it for the first time, even though I was Tamil, I didn't know any of, most of the characters were mentioned in the book, or most of the personalities were mentioned in the book. But the stories, nevertheless, transmitted themselves to me. And second, we do live in the age of the internet where learning about these things is just one click away. So I felt that a curious reader would make the effort themselves.
No, I googled about Mauni after reading Perivali. Now, I bought Mauni's short stories, which were translated into English. Still, he's a very tough nut to crack. Whole story is kind of a metaphor, I believe. I think he's one of the great writers that you have in Tamil. He wrote very few stories, I believe. I think.
Yeah, I'm actually guilty of not having read Mauni so far, so I'll probably get to it after this podcast. Now that you've mentioned it.
Coming back to Stories of the True, most of these stories have a very solid spiritual streak in them. For that matter, Peruvali, Palm Leaf Cross, and One World, I consider them as a trilogy. It's all about spirituality dealt in a very interesting way, differently in all three stories.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute observation you make. Yes, if you think of spirituality as a association with something that's bigger than yourself, you can call it by different names: universe, cosmos, God, whatever that might be for you. If you think of spirituality as an association with something bigger than yourself, or a search for something bigger than yourself, then certainly I think what you're saying is true. You can think of these three stories as as a sort of trilogy in this theme. Um, but I also think that that element is there in all of the stories, in one way or the other, because when I was sitting, when I reflected on the book after I finished translating it, it almost felt like there was, in many of the stories, there was this one character who had understood what the meaning of their life was, what the purpose of their life was, and was working towards it. Whereas there was another character who was still on that journey. So if you look at Palm Leaf Cross, for instance, there's Howard Somerville who has figured out his life, and he's just working with a missionary zeal, towards a particular objective. And then you have this young man who is still grappling with this faith, and so he's still in search for of that truth. What is the truth, for himself. And that's, for me, what made these stories very real and very interesting, is this tension between someone who knows, and someone who's in the search for truth.
Yes. In fact, as far as Palm Leaf Cross is concerned, it's one of the best endings of a short story. that I have come across in my limited exposure period.
Mm.
Coming to the translation part of it, right? Mm, when I was reading it, right, two of the stories. One is Noor Narkali, that is 100 armchairs. Other one is the churning curd. I was just wondering how you could translate them. The Noor Narkalgal, the 100 armchairs, is a very, very emotionally draining story. And when you are translating it, probably, I don't know, you must have read it 20 times, 30 times. And the other one is Churning Cut because there are a lot of references to Kamba Ramayana. Verses are there. Which of these stories you had a sigh of relief as soon as you finished translation?
Probably every one of them because this was my first collection. But jokes apart, I think there were two kinds of challenges I would say in translating these stories, and maybe even translating Jayamohan in general. One is the intensity of his prose, right? And the intensity of the stories themselves. You can't, while you're translating it word for word by word or line by line, you still cannot disassociate yourself completely from the power of these stories. So, as you said, even as I was translating it in many of the stories, I had tears in my eyes, and you almost go into this intense world. And when you even if I do a couple of pages, sometimes I would feel like I was exhausted by the time I was finished with the exercise. That is one. I think the other challenge was, of course, rendering this emotionality into a new language. And in some ways, I think of English as a world that is almost, sanitized, right? You're not given to these big emotions, whereas in Tamil and maybe I would say in various other non English Indian languages, we are expressive people, we are emotional people, and I feel that that should not be sandpapered. That's the way it's been rendered in Tamil, and that's the way it should, transfer itself to the English audience as well. In some ways, maybe they are also. It's also cultural exposure as much as a linguistic exposure, right? So that should not be sandpapered, and I was very conscious of that when I was translating these stories. Um, the two specific stories that you speak of, 100 armchairs, I actually found it to be one of the easier stories to translate. I think certainly the experience of the story is very intense. However, from a language perspective, it was not very difficult to capture the mood of that story. Um, the one thing that, in fact, lent itself well to translation is the fact that this mother character is seen as a outsider, right? She's seen as as an almost alien character, and she even the language that she uses is understood to be Tamil, but it's really not. It's the strange language that she speaks. She says Tamra, Tamra, to when she cries out to the masters, so to say, and so just retaining some of that, in the retain in the translation, I retained some of the original lines, and I felt that it sort of gave it that alien character for the mother. So I found that it lent itself quite well to translation. The one story that I actually or other two, I would say, that I found that I had to work hard at was, one was Peacock Blue, and the other one was Nutcase. Nutcase, because I think humor is one of the toughest things to translate, and you can't disassociate humor from Pumede's character, right? And he is an eccentric, and therefore, the entire story is in that hasya rasa, if I can call it. And that I had to convey that there were those witty remarks that he makes in English, and that was difficult. The other one was Peacock Blue, because the the entire story is built on the atmosphere of the place, and also the atmosphere that music brings. And for someone who's not familiar with Carnatic, when if you're familiar with Carnatic music, and especially in Tamil, I think "Toondil Pulvinai Pol," there's a line, and that will automatically evoke an image in you. You don't need to explain it, but for someone who's reading it in English, it won't be as easy to picture just from the verse. So I had to, and I couldn't. Be explanatory about these verses in the translation, right? That would just completely destroy the musicality of the story. And just learning how to gloss some of those things. And I was actually, that was one of the stories that gave me a lot of satisfaction when I was done with it. Churning Curd as well, since you mentioned it, similar. I mean, I had never translated poetry before. I still haven't, except for the verses that featured in the Aram collection. But those were only a couple of passages. The rest of it was, largely moves through dialogue.
Now, your collaboration with fellow translator Suchitra Ramchandran, could you please tell us about it?
I think Suchitra and I, curiously, we were introduced to each other through the letters that we used to write to Jeyamohan. And Jeyamohan publishes a lot of the reader letters on his blog. So I knew of her and she knew of me, um, because obviously you don't have, I mean, too many women or as many, you don't have, you have probably more men than women writing in. So it just stands out. So we knew of each other, and we met at actually a meet that Demon had organized to get introduced to his new readers. So he was doing a number of these across Tamil Nadu. And while she's based in Switzerland, she happened to be visiting India, and we met for the first time in Tanjavur, where this meet was happening. And at that point, I had maybe translated a couple of stories from Aram, and she had translated Periyamma and Circle, which Periyamma's words, which went on to win the Asymptote Prize. So we just found that we had very similar interests and similar inclinations. But at that point, it wasn't much more than that. I think we just knew of each other, and we were in touch very sporadically. It was when I think we got serious about doing book length works that we started sort of interacting more. And today, I think. Um, we share our translations with each other and seek feedback. That is one, but we've also gone on to collaborate in this initiative called Mori, because we felt that and it was also a realization that we came to in the process of pitching our books, that there is not enough of a dialogue between readers in various languages. And while we keep complaining about the publishing industry not knowing enough about the writers in various languages, I think it's not possible, humanly possible, unless you have a very robust dialogue going on. And we felt that a platform like Mori was essential to foreground some of these conversations. So we started the first year. We launched the Mori Prize, that was in 2022, which awarded translations from Tamil to English. These were short story translations, and we hope to do more this year.
Very, very nice. Now, what are the projects that you are currently working on?
So at this point, I'm working on a novel, again by Jeyamohan. This is a historical novel called Vellai Yaanai. So the working title is White Elephant in English. So how this happened was, I applied to the American Literary Translators Association mentorship program, and I got selected. And this was the work that I had pitched as part of that. So um, this is a historical novel that is set in the late 1800s. And interestingly, it's set in Madras. And that was one of the hooks for me because I come from the city and I felt this is a book that I must translate. It belongs to me in some ways. And so I got, and it is. Actually told through the eyes of a foreigner, and perhaps it's the first Tamil novel to do so. So the protagonist is an Irishman, an Irish police officer who is working under the British Crown. And one of the reasons I chose this for the mentorship program was I felt there are various foreign voices in the book and Indian voices too. So working with someone who was a mentor who was not familiar with Tamil, I felt would actually help in the search for the right language for the novel, right? So I work with Kareem Abu James Zaid, who's an Arabic to English translator, and greatly benefited from his feedback as well. In that process, I discovered this Penheim grant, and so I applied to it, and I was fortunate to be selected as well. And it was the first time a novel or a work from any of the South Indian languages was being picked in the grant. So that was a very gratifying moment. So with all of this assistance, I've been making progress on this novel. I have completed a full draft, and I'm now working on revising and editing it.
So, when is it coming out?
I don't have a date yet because I've just begun pitching it to publishers, and I'm hoping that it will happen in by the end of this year. Let's see, fingers crossed.
Translation, I read somewhere it's kind of a meditative reading. And reading stories of the true is a very, very intense experience. What kind of an effect it had on you?
Um, I'm not sure if you know any one book can like completely change your life. But what I can certainly say is it this is a book that set me on or opened many doors for me. One is, of course, as I said, to Tamil literature itself. um, uh, Second is in terms of discovering my passion for translation. Both of these happened through this collection. There's no doubt about that. um, I think the other, I mean, if I just treat it as a work and keep aside what it's done to me, from a writing point of view, um, I think for me the biggest takeaway from the collection was the fact that are these are stories about idealists, and I would like to think of myself in my late teens and early 20s. That's how I thought of myself, and over time, somewhere, the life and the experiences probably upgraded that idealism, and these stories really brought that back. And as Jayamohan says, it isn't an unattainable idealism, right? So all of these characters, they their idealism or their search for truth exists in parallel with all the realities of life. It is not something that is completely romanticized, and it is unattainable. And I think it was a book that served as a reminder for that. Um, and I think whenever I think about all the challenges in even pursuing this career in translation, because you're doing this aside alongside a full-time job and so on and so forth. I remind myself of the missionary zeal with which some of these characters worked. And even Jayamohan himself, I think, is a personification of that missionary zeal. And so, yeah, it serves as a daily inspiration as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. In fact, writer Jayamohan is quite popular in Telugu too. Thanks to my good friend Avineni Bhaskar. He's a wonderful translator, and he started translating Aram stories from Tamil to Telugu, and some of them got published in Emata, very popular e-magazine, and
Wonderful.
they're just loved. So widely, a lot of critical acclaim, and many people wrote to him. And Chaya Publications of Hyderabad, they are going to publish the Aram stories into Telugu. And Jaymohan sir, told Bhaskar that he will be here in Hyderabad during the launch of the book.
Amazing.
Yeah, we hope to see you in Hyderabad very soon. I believe it is going to get launched in the month of August, I believe.
That's wonderful. I mean, I'm very, very, very happy to hear that. August would mean exactly 1 year since the book came out in English. I'm thrilled to hear about this, and I'd love to be there. Do let me know.
Hope to see you soon in Hyderabad. All the very best to you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you for having me on the podcast.